So I kept my title deliberately vague, using electronic health resources to support care and research. And as Neil has pretty much already stolen my thunder, and I'll just go straight on to the Salford lung studies. And I start with this because, having spent a lot of time going to the US recently, US audiences get really bored very quickly unless you tell them the punchline before you then tell them the story. So the punchline is, here in Manchester, we managed to do 2 phase 3 trials to all of the regulatory compliance that you have to do for phase 3 trials. It was sponsored by GSK, as Neil has said. That's over 7,200 people. And we monitored those people in a way that no one has ever done before, using real-time safety monitoring and using outcomes almost entirely from using their electronic health records and linking those across the city. No one's ever done it before. It's the first in the world. It was used to evaluate, in a pre-licensed setting, one of GSK's medicines, now known as Relvar. And it was done in 2 studies, one in COPD and one in asthma. And I'm pleased to say that from the purposes of my CV, it's improved things remarkably, because one was published in the New England Journal and the other was published in the Lancet. So very grateful to GSK for that. I should point out this cost GSK reputedly about £80 million to do. And I want you to bear that figure in mind as we go through. So everyone's got a slide that looks a little bit like this. And I think everyone can gel with this. So it takes far too long to get from the left-hand side of that to the right-hand side. It doesn't matter what you're doing, whether it's a drug, a device, a diagnostic, a care pathway, initiative, you name it, it takes far too long. But when we're talking about drugs, somewhere in the middle of that, the company will apply for and will get market authorization. And generally speaking, before that point, we're looking at efficacy studies, and after that point, we're looking at effectiveness, because we're trying to convince 2 different groups of people. We're trying to convince the regulators around efficacy, does the drug work? And we're trying to convince the health technology appraisal agencies about, is it cost effective, should we buy it, who should we use it in, etc. And in our case, of course, that would be NICE, here in Manchester mainly. The Salford lung studies, happily, for my career, sit somewhere in the middle. They were actually designed, GSK's idea was that they would do this study so that they would come to market authorization with their effectiveness data, therefore being able to sell their drug from day one at the right price to the right people. Really great idea. Turns out it was a little bit more complicated than that. We didn't quite manage that, so we were about 18 months late in terms of them getting market authorization. But we straddle that period, and that's really important because we've done an effectiveness study, but we've done it to phase 3 regulatory standards. So we've learned how to do trials in the real world. I'm trying to avoid using the term real world data because I don't know what that means. So, and Rory's hinted a bit at this already, the UK is just a fabulous place to be able to do things like this. We have the National Health Service and everybody's in it. I have so many conversations with people from outside the UK going, well, we need a registry. We don't need a registry because everybody's in the NHS. The other thing that is a huge advantage is that although all of the data in the NHS is just as siloed as it is in the US or anywhere else, the nice thing is we can bring it all together because we all have a unique identifier, an NHS number, which from a data perspective means we can amalgamate the data and be confident that it's the same person. And in primary care, GPs have been using electronic health record systems since the mid-90s. And it's a really mature system now, and it's got really quite, to your point, it's got really pretty well-coded data in there now. There is a national infrastructure for doing research. Again, very few countries have that. I have to say that because they pay part of my salary. And then why Salford? Well, Salford was just a little bit ahead of the game, and I won't go into why, but it's slightly accidental. So Salford has a population of near enough 250,000. It's got one hospital in the middle, it's one city. People don't move in or out very much. And what we have built since about 2003, 2004 is fully integrated electronic health record system between primary and secondary care. And a track record of using that for improving care and for doing research. And that is why GSK came to us. We didn't go looking for them. They were looking around the world to do somewhere like this. And quite bizarrely, they ended up in Salford, which is not probably where they wanted to, because having spoken to their respiratory franchise lead, he was quite keen on Montpellier. But they got Salford, which in many ways is similar, as I'm sure you realise. As Neil has said, we set up a collaborative venture between the University of Manchester and both of the NHS organisations in Salford, and we called that Northwest eHealth. It was originally funded by the Northwest Regional Development Agency, and then subsequently, from 2011 onwards, it's been entirely self-funding and became, as Neil says, a company a couple of years back. So what I call this, and it's a term that I use, which feel free to use it because I would like it to be used a lot, is a connected community of care. Because you can have the best infrastructure in terms of electronic health records in the world, but if all the doctors and nurses and pharmacists in it hate each other and don't want to work with each other, it's not going to deliver what we did here. You have to have the people engaged with the process. Now I want to just go back in time. So I said we got everything set up in 2003 to do this. So why did it take us in 2011 we started doing the Salford lung studies. So how come it took us so long? And why was the Salford lung study so expensive? This is the first ever study we did using this. We called it the SPLINT trial, which if you're really interested, it stands for Specialist Nurse-Led Intervention for blood pressure and cholesterol control. And we randomised people as they came through the doors of the diabetes service to either just seeing me or seeing me plus a research nurse who would either help them look after their blood pressure or their cholesterol. This was a long time ago, as you can see from the dates. And it was the first time we actually just used the routine electronic health record system to tell us what happened. So we just sat back and waited 15 months, and all those people came back through the system and had their blood pressure checked by an uncaring mechanism, not the research team, just the system. And, well, surprise, surprise, it worked. It turns out nurses were much better at doing it than doctors. You probably knew that. What did surprise us in the secondary analysis was that you're approximately half as likely to die if you saw the nurses than if you saw me, which was somewhat a sobering thought. And then we did a subsequent economic analysis on that, and the qualities for that blew everything else out of the water. So go back to my thing about 10 to 15 years to do things. Are we doing this? Is this happening? No. And yet we have good evidence that actually that's the right approach. This cost £150,000. A randomised trial of 1,400 people. The Salford lung study cost £80 million, a randomised trial of 7,200 people. And we can argue later as to why there is such a big discrepancy between those. This was the Salford lung study COPD trial, 2,800 patients. And you're randomised either to the study medication and usual care, or just usual care. And the difference between this and any other phase 3 trial I've been involved in is that it was a 12-month study, but there were really only 2 visits. One at the beginning and one 12 months later. So we had to convince the regulators that we could do all the safety monitoring, all the outcomes and everything else in between times using a linked electronic health record system, which is what we did. This was not an easy marriage between the clinical operations team of GSK and ourselves, because none of us knew how to do this. And most clinical operations groups in big pharma do not do this kind of thing. They don't take data directly from source. They have an electronic case report form and you put all the data into it, and then at the end you analyse it. We were taking data directly from source, so you don't have to do all the checking that you would normally do, because it's from source, and there's far more of it. This took a long time to get across. What data were there? How good were they, to the point of the question earlier? How could we validate it? What were the needs of the research authorities, the regulators, and the payers? And did we actually have a significantly large population to actually do this, to power this kind of study? That's all the stuff we had to do up front. It took us about a year to do that. And the number of people you have to talk to get this done is huge. GPs, pharmacists, specialists, regulators, payers, hospital managers, CIOs, etc. You can read it. And then, because it's a phase 3 trial and we're doing it to normal regulatory standards, we have to GCP train all of the people involved. We GCP trained 3,000 people for this study. Very expensive, very time consuming. And then on the data side, we had to build a fully validated system, devise a process for managing the data flows, build the safety, deliver it to the sponsor in the way they were expecting it, and of course, at the end of it all, find an archival solution because no one's ever archived a real-world trial before. And then on the delivery side, we had to make sure that we knew how to recruit the patients, where to recruit the patients, and manage all of that. So we built one of these. So it takes data from national systems. So if you get run over in Southampton, we know you have been at some point, and that we get the data back for that. If you change your name or move or whatever, we get the data from the Exeter data set. The GPs were the principal investigators. There were 88 of them. The pharmacies dispensed the drugs. There were 144 of them. We had out-of-hours services. We had a very tiny electronic case report form for the first and last visit. And then we had 2 hospitals linked into it. One, the all-singing, all-dancing Salford Royal, with all of its fancy electronic health record systems. And the other, what was then University Hospital of South Manchester, which was more kind of steam age. But they had a lot of legacy systems that we could pull the data into, and we linked all of those. So actually, you could do this anywhere in the UK. We now know that. And we produced all of the outputs that you need for this: safety monitoring in real time, study data, performance management, and other regulatory requirements. Just a quick word on the safety monitoring, because this is so much better than anything I've been experienced in trials before. So if you're tagged in this system and you end up in the emergency room, so the accident emergency, we know you're there. We can look at what the clinicians have written in your notes. We can pull up your chest film and look at it. We can look at your ECG tracing. So we can very quickly determine whether this looks like an SAE or not. We can send a link back to the GP, who just has to tick a box around causality and severity, and that goes straight off to the sponsor and then to the regulator. It's amazing. In fact, it's too amazing, because you end up with an awful lot of follow-up reports, which was swamping both the sponsor system and the MHRA. So eventually we learnt to batch these. Now what that means is that we've inadvertently invented a tunable safety monitoring system, which you can have turned up to full for an early phase trial, where you're getting real-time monitoring, or if you're in the post-marketing surveillance phase, you can turn it right back down, and you can say, we just want reports every 6 months, every 12 months. There were so many barriers to overcome. I've just abbreviated it. You name it. This was a study falling off a cliff every day. But we managed to do all of these things. What did we learn? We learnt that disruptive innovation is disruptive and painful for all of those involved. And what we now know is that the sooner you can engage with people and manage expectations, the easier it's going to be. This was a learning experience for us and the sponsor. They'd never done it before. We'd never done it before. We probably learned 999 ways of not doing a kind of trial like this, and one way of doing it. And more data is not the answer. You have to have the right data. A lot of people come along to us now, they look at what we've got and they go, we want all of that. And you really don't want all of that. You just need to pick what you need. Of course, there's great advantages to this. If you take data directly from source, there are there are no transcription errors because you're taking it directly from source. Although you do have to prove, of course, that you have not modified it in that process, and we spend a lot of time doing that. So if we go back to what I showed you before and just put that back up. So we have now developed a whole load of bits that help you do this across all that. And you can have the whole singing, dancing thing that I've shown you, or you can just have a few modules. So we've got a feasibility and recruitment tool, we can do your trial, we can do real-time safety monitoring, we can do electronic patient reporting outcomes, and we can look at care pathway analysis. And you can pick and choose from that. Here's the feasibility and recruitment system. We have a system called Farsight, covers about, I think it's somewhere between 200 and 250 practices in Manchester now. You won't be able to read this, but if you were able to read it, that's the researcher view. It's anonymized data, so you can spend your life refining your trial until you get it looking how you expect it to. It's designed for research nurses to use, not computer scientists. If you were able to see this, it would show you how many patients in Salford right now have diabetes, are on a statin, but have a cholesterol above target. And I'll tell you, there are 239,000 people, 10,934 have type 2 diabetes, 8,000 are on a statin, and about 4,500 are above target, which shows you what a great job we're doing. By the way, I'm a diabetologist, I should have said that. So I'm doing a really poor job. And then I can tell you which GP practices they go to, and the GP gets a link to say, these are the patients that you need to look at. And it re-identifies the patients to them. So I can't see who those patients are, but the GP can. So this is massively helpful for recruitment to trials, but also, again, inadvertently, we've invented a health improvement tool, which you can use at scale. Here's an example of that. We were developing, as you know, there's a national diabetes prevention program now, but how do you get people into it? How do you know who these people are? So the commissioning group put in place a local enhanced service to help GPs find and appropriately code people with what I call impaired glucose regulation, but I now see as non-diabetic hypoglycemia, whatever that is. And so you can see, we introduced this in 2014, you can see how very quickly that ramps up. And of course, we can then link that to a recruitment system to the behavioral change program that we have in place. Back to data, very briefly. This is the data you get from a standard RCT. You get data from first subject visit to last subject, last visit, and you get whatever is in your ECRF, so that much. For the Salford lung study, we asked for data for 3 years beforehand to look at exacerbations, and we got a bigger depth of data. In fact, for the asthma study, I think we transferred about 750 million rows of data, several billion data items to GSK for that trial. And they're going to be analysing it for some time. But actually, with the right consent, because all of these patients were consented, you can have this much information. And you can link all of that across all of the different systems that we have. So it opens up the possibilities of looking at an entire patient journey, seeing who responds, who doesn't respond, what the cost effectiveness is, and so on. Very much in keeping with what Rory was saying. Benefits, design. It reduces the influence of research on patients' normal care, because a lot of the people, if you ask them in the Salford lung study, they didn't even know they were in a trial anymore. They'd kind of forgotten because they're just being monitored in the background. So it doesn't, you get a more realistic population. It's easy for them to volunteer. You can look at protocol analysis requirements. You can look at adherence. You can design the trials up front with regulators, payers, and the consumers. You can deliver this much more easily because you don't have to do as much checking. There's far less manually entered data, so fewer errors. But I think we have to challenge and revise existing standards and working practice to make this kind of thing happen at scale. In terms of deployment, we can utilize data from EHRs to understand the patient pathway and disease before we ever start. So our trials are much more driven to the usual care environment that we want to then impact So what are the challenges for scaling this everywhere else? So I think this connected communities of care thing is an important one, because unless you've got the right environment to put all of your technology into, it ain't going to work. You've got to have people that are used to working with each other, that trust each other, that are prepared to work across the institutional boundaries. Data standards are important. Data availability is important, and its quality, but these are not they don't stop you doing it. Interoperability is a word that we use a lot, but very few people can do it. And we need regulatory support for change. So what we've asked for now, I just put up, this is what we did. That's the Salford lung study thing, but as everybody in the room will know, and I'm sure Paul will be telling us in a minute, you know, you can add a whole shed load of other stuff to that now. You've got much higher quality imaging and data with that, wearables, smart devices, a lot of omics for stratifying patients up front or looking at responses. And of course, that is going to generate so much information that any human probably can't analyze it very well. So there's going to have to be some artificial intelligence solutions to looking at safety monitoring and data analysis as well. And that's just a warm-up for John Ainsworth, who's going to be talking later, really. So if we go back to my original thing, if you put all this stuff together and you actually do it early, so you don't do this like GSK did right at the end of your phase 3 program. You start thinking about how you would do this phase 2, and you blur all of the margins around efficacy and effectiveness. Then you can actually shorten the whole time frame. And it took me so long to do that slide, I almost want to show it to you again. But if we can shrink those timelines, it really does create that win-win-win situation we're trying to get, because it costs far too much to develop drugs at the moment. I think it's about $2.8 billion for every new drug at the moment. And a lot of that is going into the trial programs. We can shorten all of that. Companies happy, it's cost them less. They have a longer patent life. They can pass on some of that cost saving to the payers. Great, we can actually afford to buy the new drugs. And from a patient perspective, we're going to get them sooner. So that's going to be a good thing. So I'm going to finish on this slide. I think the UK is probably one of the best placed countries to do this. We've already got a track record. Increasingly, we're moving into cloud infrastructure. We've moved all of that platform that I showed you before, which was bespoke initially, into cloud infrastructure inside the NHS. It's all fully validated now. We can run multiple trials in multiple indications using it. I've shown you the suite of applications. I've shown you the fact that we can interconvert data between different data schemas. So, you know, if you get read codes from GPs and ICD-10 codes from hospitals, you want it all in SNOMED CT, and you then want the output in CDISC, SDTM, or FHIR, or OMOP, we can do all that. All of that's now achievable. So we're extending the footprint. The current studies that we're running here in Manchester, instead of the 2 hospitals, we've got 9 hospitals involved in that now. And we had 88 GPs, the Salford lung study. I think we're over 200 now that we reach. Better pharmacy data is happening anywhere across the country through EPS2. And people, as I say, are increasingly wanting to build in other data sources to get more value out of the data. And so we would like to find out, if there's anyone in the room that would like to talk to me, about where we should go next to build one of these systems and build a community of care so that we can do more of this in the UK. Thanks for listening.